Hello, everyone. This is Banahan, and welcome to We Make Fly Fishing Simple. My guest today is Bill Coleman, a certified FFF fly fishing instructor and a very strong and smart instructor in ways that'll help us all become better at what we do. Bill is experienced in both saltwater and fresh and has a very interesting perspective on how we learn. I'd like to share that with you today, and let's go ahead. Welcome to the show, Bill. Hello, Bill. We've been talking about the idea of a show on fly fishing instruction from your perspective for a while now. I'm interested in your perspective as a lifelong fly fisherman and a certified FFF instructor. But tell us a little bit about yourself and why you became an FFF instructor, and tell us a little bit about FFF. Why did you choose FFF, or why did they choose you?
Okay, good to be here today. I wanted to do more fishing, and I wanted to be a better caster. So I got this idea that if I could be a casting instructor, then I could accomplish a couple of different goals at that point in time. And I went on the website, FFF, and found that there were several certified instructors close to me in Beaufort, South Carolina. So I contacted couple of these guys and asked if they would show me the ropes, and they agreed to do that. And I joined FFF, and I joined their program to become certified. And over a period of about a year, maybe a little more, I went through all of the phases of learning about casting, about teaching. And then you have to pass a skills test and a written test. And then the most difficult of all the tests, you have to pass a teaching class. And that's given by,
isn't it?
Yeah, it's given by a master casting instructor who is very comfortable in working with other casting instructors. So it's an instructor teaching an instructor. And actually, no one takes that test for granted. I didn't take it for granted. My mentor told me originally, Bill, you're not ready to take this test. And I did videos. I made the videos myself, and when I was practicing instructing. So that's how that all came together. And ultimately, FFF has been a tremendous organization to be associated with in every way. They were formed at about 65 or so out in Livingston, Montana. And their entire purpose is to further the whole sport of fly fishing, fly casting, fly tying, preservation, conservation of fisheries. They are a tremendous organization, well capitalized, and certainly international in scope.
Great. You make a very interesting distinction between instruction and just learning to cast. Give us a little bit on your thinking there. I think it's interesting.
Well, I like to always think about one of the old instructors who's no longer with us, Mel Krieger. I've watched a lot of Mel's videos. I've read a lot of his books. He actually wrote a book on observations on teaching fly casting. I have it right here. It was put out by the FFF, and he tries to teach instructors how to interpret what's happening with their students in the learning process, because everyone learns differently. Some people, Mel called them engineers. Right. They want to quantify everything. They want the physics behind the cast. Some people are poets. They're much more interested in the form, the aesthetics of the cast, the timing of the cast. They're not particularly interested in about the forces involved in bending the rod and what have you. So there's a difference. You've got to interpret the student that you're working with in such a way that you can get across to them what they need to know to learn, not what you want to teach, what they're picking up.
I was impressed with your perspective on learning too. As you point out, we have engineers and poets. When you communicate with a student, you take that into account and reach them in the way that you see that they learn best. Is that a fair representation of your thinking on this?
Yes, I absolutely believe in that. And sometimes you have to struggle in order to communicate with that student, and it's worth the effort.
I bet it is. That leads us to the holy grail now. There's a lot to learn in fly fishing, but I don't want to scare anyone off. That's not the purpose of why we make fly fishing simple. But talk about the five basic principles. When you reach someone on that level, is it easier for them to learn and adopt the five basic principles? Is that what I hear?
You know, I really think it's so important to understand why there is five basic principles. And the reason is simply this, because fly fishing is taught all over the world. And you should be confident as an instructor that what you're teaching is exactly the same curriculum and points that are being made in Japan or Alaska or wherever that is going on. So those five basic principles go across all methods of instruction.
That's
And
very interesting. If you travel around the world to fish, and some of us have been fortunate to be able to fish in other places than the States, and the principles never change. Saltwater has different tactics, certainly, than freshwater, but regardless, you're adapting your fly fishing skill in the same freshwater way that you did in the States in some cases, and the same is true for saltwater. Is that fair?
that's absolutely fair. Naturally, when you're fishing salt water, you're fishing in an environment where the predator is chasing the prey. When you're fishing in a stream or a river for trout, let's say, you're fishing in an environment where you're trying to fool the trout into thinking that that bug that's floating on the surface coming toward him is a real bug. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not, it's coming toward the trout and you trying to make him eat it. Therefore, what you're trying to accomplish is what we call a drag-free drift.
Right.
So that looks real to the fish in that particular example. Now, the major difference between saltwater and freshwater fishing is freshwater fishing, you're confined to a river or a stream, your casts are shorter, more technical, you have to be well aware of what's going on entomology wise with the insects in that environment. You're fishing in saltwater, you're fishing in unlimited fish, always have no boundaries to be able to control the cast with the wind and control the line. And you're fishing for bigger fish naturally.
And it's a big difference.
Oh, that's a huge difference. And naturally, we all who love to fish, fly fish, we kind of go toward the one area that we like the most. I have some buddies that love to trout fish. Well, I'm sorry, I am a saltwater guy. So
you heard it here. What's interesting? The first time, if you've grown up fishing freshwater, but the first time you hook up to a caudal tail fish, and I guess I'm talking about bonefish here for a second, or in our case, in this part of the world, you hook up to a little toonie or a false albacore, and that thing just takes off like a rocket, and you say, "Oh my God, this is going to be a hell of a ride, isn't it?" And it's like nothing you've caught in freshwater, and it just snaps you to attention immediately. It's phenomenal.
yes, it is. And naturally, in saltwater, you never know what's going to happen. You just don't know. You see a flash down there and you get a fly down through that flash. You really don't know. That might be a permit. It might be a jack. It might be anything down there that's going to eat that fly. I was fishing in Cuba, and that's exactly what happened. I caught 5 different fish, same fly, one day. It was
amazing.
A wonderful experience. But let's go back to the principles. Let me just state the principles. And after I do that, I want to talk a little bit about loop formation, because I want to just make the listening audience, I want to make them comfortable with the idea of the 5 principles that are not difficult to learn, and they don't have to come in any specific order. So I'm just going to state them basically what they are. And this is just what the order they were in the book. You've got to pause at the end of each stroke. And the pause time will vary with the amount of line out at the end of the tip. Long line, long pause. Yeah, slack line, you've got to keep slack to a minimum. When you move the tip of the fly rod, you want the fly to move. If it's not moving, all you're moving is slack. That's inefficient. You need to move the rod tip in a straight line path. And when we talk a little more about loops, you'll see exactly what I mean, because that is an issue that a lot of casters are a little confused about. They say, well, how can you move the rod tip in a straight line? It bends. But we'll get to that point. And then the casting arc has got to vary with the stroke length and the amount of line outside the tip, because the more line, the more weight, the deeper rod will bend. And the deeper the rod bends, the wider the arc to get a straight line path of the rod tip. All works together. Okay, the last point was on the application of power in the cast. And naturally, that there's a lot of variables there, but basically speaking, you want to apply power consistently, and you want to smoothly accelerate that rod. And we'll get in a little more into that when we talk about formation of this loop as well. So those 5 fundamentals override everything else about the cast. And there are many other points, the 180-degree rule and the target and what have you, and many win rules that you can make. And they're all good. So in any event, I'd like to shift now just a little bit and talk about the loop. And by the way, I'm at a great disadvantage because you may or may not know, I've done a lot of flying when I was in the military, and pilots use their hands. So pilots and flycasters use their hands. We like to show things with our hands.
I don't think anyone's ever put those two ideas together on a show like this. You're the first.
Anyway, let's talk quickly about loops. Why are loops important? Well, loops are important because when you have a fly line extending from a rod tip and you move that tip forward and stop it, what happens? Okay, here's my analogy I want you to stay with now. That rod is on a track, and on that rod tip is the engine. Right on that rod tip. So that you move that engine and then you stop it right there. And what happens? Well, at the back of the train, you have the caboose. And the caboose comes up and starts to catch up with the engine. And that caboose will travel exactly in the line that the engine traveled in. So if that engine traveled in this line, that caboose will travel in that line. If that engine came off the plane, that caboose will come off the plane. If that engine dropped below the line of the rod tip, that caboose will drop below. Okay, you can refer to the caboose as the what? The fly leg of the loop, and the engine as what? The rod leg. So the fly leg is always the top loop, and the rod leg is always the bottom loop. And the top loop is always overtaking the rod loop. And that's why it's so important that your rod move exactly in a plane that's exactly matched by what your hand is doing. If you want to have a downward movement with your arm, that's okay. If that's the way you want to cast, just be aware that that will absolutely pull the caboose down. The fly leg will go down. If you want a tight loop, you've got to track the fly leg exactly with the rod leg. And that's in a straight line, straight across.
Great.
Now, that's the concept that you've got to understand. Naturally, the idea of a long line, long pause, long stroke is very important. Now, let me say right here that the other area that I wanted to talk about today was the idea of stroke length versus rod arc. Most people don't understand that. The casting stroke involves both a movement of the arm and hand and traverses. And most beginners, they go like this. They do a windshield and they think this is a cast. That's not a cast. This is a cast. You're moving that you're making a stroke right on line, right on that line. And the power comes right there, right on that line. You keep that rod moving on that track and the power stays right on that track. That's critical in your practice and getting that feel for that movement with your hand. And that will all work together with the 5 fundamentals, and you'll never have a problem. It will all work together. Long line, long pause, long stroke. Even when you learn to double haul, long haul, and even when you learn to drift a fly rod to extend the length of your stroke, you drift, make a long drift with a long line. So it all works together. It's not magical. It's part of learning how to cast and becoming familiar with the rod. Now, the other last point I'll make is the line hand. Don't understand how important the line hand is. I know you do, Brendan, because you're a saltwater guy too. That line hand that left hand is just critical in line management, and just as importantly in the double haul, and just as importantly in strip striking of saltwater fish. So these little things are fun things to learn in fly casting, and I look forward to sharing those with my students as in the years to come.
Bill, you've given us a very interesting perspective on instruction and learning, and I'm looking at the way you move your hands and the way you explain it. I think we're going to have you back for another show on the water somewhere. We don't do too much of that because we're not a well-funded broadcasting vehicle here. But at the end of the day, I think for our YouTube channel, we're going to have you back. Well, you and I will try to put something together before the weather gets away from us. If not, we'll do it in the spring. I'd love to fish salt water with you one day. It'd be great. But I can't thank you enough for your time and your instruction and your patience and your great description for this. I'm looking forward to our next show.
Thank you very much.
Good to see you.
Okay, my pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Good seeing you.